thank you to all the members of the EDC committee for inviting me to give this year's lecture. It is indeed an honour to be able to do so. So, to begin, in 1513, Castiglione wrote about the difficulties he was having during the rehearsals for a production at Urbino. Quote, "The intermedio about the battles was unfortunately true to our disgrace. The intermedi were made very much in a hurry, and I had to fight with the painters, the master carpenters, the actors, musicians, and the dancers. Unfortunately, we do not know exactly what caused the arguments between Castiglione and all the personnel involved in this production, and neither do we know how these difficulties were resolved. But Castiglione's letter reminds us that then, as now, not everything went as smoothly as those in charge would have hoped for." Right. Great. Sorry, that was the image of Castiglione, which I should have clicked before. Right. In spite, I think we're right now, that was my disaster for this. In spite of the many growing reports as to the success of the theatrical spectacles in early modern Europe, the wonder and amazement of the audience, the brilliance of the glittering costumes, the quantity of jewels and precious stones worn by the performers, and the virtuosity of the dancing, problems were encountered during production and performance. It is this aspect of Renaissance spectacles that is the focus of today's lecture. I will begin with a discussion of the desire for a successful outcome and what efforts went into achieving this aim, before moving to an examination of what disasters did occur, from audience overcrowding and noise, stage fright of the performers, properties being too big to fit through the door of the hall in which the performance was taking place, to more serious catastrophes such as a fire during a performance. I will conclude this lecture with an examination of audience reaction to such disasters and the effects of these disasters on the dynamics between spectators and performers. In early modern Europe, theatrical spectacles usually carried serious political messages regarding the relationship between the monarch and the state. They were far more than an evening's entertainment, and a successful performance greatly enhanced a country's reputation on the international stage. Expert and virtuosic displays of dancing added to the prestige of a court and was one measure of its sophistication and, by extension, the sophistication of the country as a whole. Dance spectacles were part of the political process, as rulers used multimedia spectacles to further their domestic and foreign policies, as well as a vehicle for the expression of diplomatic positions and the dissemination of the image of himself or herself that a ruler wished to project. While spectacles were employed by a monarch to reinforce his or her political authority, they were also part of the ongoing negotiations between a ruler and the political factions of a court as to the amount of political authority each would allow the other to hold. As Catherine Butler has commented in regard to Queen Elizabeth I's entertainments and spectacles, although they always preserved the outward trappings of royal compliment, the diverse interests and intentions jostling for position within courtly entertainments only intensified the further from her control they were. Given what was at stake in a Renaissance festival, and the number of political messages that found expression in these spectacles, it is no surprise, therefore, that there was a very strong desire for a successful outcome, and a great deal of effort, money, and time went into ensuring that problems did not arise. For example, the Medici Grand Duke Cosimo II was so insistent on proper order and discipline on stage from the singers, actors, and stagehands that he kept two dwarfs armed with crossbows and instructions to shoot at anyone who made themselves visible to the audience by leaning out from between the upstage wings, thereby ruining the perspective and potentially interfering with the stage machines. While the measures employed by Cosimo to keep the technical crew in order may have been a little extreme, what was very common was the large amount of time and expense devoted to rehearsals, both on stage and off. During the Renaissance, those involved in creating multimedia spectacles, playwrights, poets, choreographers, and composers, all recognised that rehearsals were essential for a successful production of their work, stressing in letters to their noble patrons that enough time must be devoted to pre-production practice. This is illustrated by the letter of Giovanni Battista Guarini in 1584, when writing about his musical drama Il Pastor Fido, quote, "My tragicomedy is full of novelty and the grandest gestures and movements, all of which must be fitted together and with much diligence practiced and repracticed on stage. This especially applies to a game which has been put into the third act, into the form of a ballo for a chorus of nymphs." End quote. Even for a performance of a military spectacle like a barriers, as you can see here, an example of a barriers, contemporaries recognised the need for practice beforehand, quote, "The barriers, because they are performed in time to the music and with measured blows, must be very well studied and rehearsed beforehand," end quote. In his diary about the Medici court, for example, Cesare Tinghi records that rehearsals for barriers performed on the 17th and again on the 19th of February 1613 started in mid-December 1612 and continued into the new year, with Tinghi again recording rehearsals on the 4th, 5th, 6th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th of February. Having adequate rehearsals was one way of trying to ensure a successful outcome, and those responsible for a spectacle sought to exercise tight control over the rehearsal process. For example, Giovanni de Badi, who was responsible for the stage direction of the 1589 Intermedi in Florence, insisted that no rehearsal of any of the Intermedi should occur unless he was present, and had given permission for the rehearsal to occur. As far as Badi was concerned, he knew what standards should be followed, even if others did not. When a dance spectacle was part of the wedding celebrations for a head of state, perfection was expected of all the parties involved, and preparations could extend for months rather than weeks. October 1608 saw the wedding of Cosimo II de Medici to Maria Magdalena of Austria, but as early as December 1607, the Florentine Grand Duke refused to lend his musicians to the Duke of Mantua, citing as his reason the fact that they were already 10 months hence fully involved in practicing for the wedding. While the Grand Duke's statement may have been an excuse, a similar time period for musical rehearsals is found 20 years later. In late October 1627, Monteverdi started the musical rehearsals of the first 3 Intermedi to accompany La Liberazione di Uggio, while still composing the music for the last 2 Intermedi. Thus, rehearsals started a year before the wedding of the Duke of Parma and Margherita de Medici actually took place in October 1628. Medici court records from 1600 to 1640 indicate that rehearsal periods of 6 to 8 weeks were common. In 1624, for example, Tinghi mentioned 6 rehearsals for the opera Santa Ursula, a work which included dancing, starting 2 months before the performance. When this opera was performed a second time, a approximately 4 months later, on the 28th of January 1625, there were another 6 weeks of rehearsing, intermingled with rehearsals for a new balletto performed by the ladies of the court, a horse ballet, both performed on the 2nd of February, and a barriers performed on the 10th of February. Similar time periods were the norm for rehearsals at the French court in the 16th century. Reports written 6 to 8 weeks before the 1581 wedding celebrations record that the king, quote, was absorbed in his horse ballets and tourneys, and the queen and her ladies in preparation for their ballets, to the extent they do nothing else, end quote. Similar rehearsal periods occurred in England. For the 1611 Masque Oberon, for example, the 2 dance masters Jeremy Hearn and Nicholas Confess were paid for their, quote, pains bestowed almost 6 weeks continually, end quote. While in 1616, maskers are recorded as practicing for 50 days. The Florentine agents' reports from England in the 1630s cite 2 or 3 weeks as the minimum rehearsal period, with this time often extending to as long as 5 weeks. The wedding celebrations of Ferdinand de Medici and Christine of Lorraine included a performance of Girolamo Bagali's comedy La Pellegrina and 6 accompanying intermedi. Rehearsals on stage in the Uffizi Theatre of the intermedi performers, singers, dancers and instrumentalists started in late December 1588, 4 months before the opening night on the 2nd of May 1589. The intermedi rehearsals became more frequent in February 1589, and in March the on-stage rehearsals also involved the machines and stage devices. The 6 intermedi varied in complexity in regard to their technical requirements, with the most simple, the 3rd intermedio, needing only 7 stage hands. However, for the 1st and last intermedi, 82 stage hands grouped into 12 teams were necessary to operate the equipment. The total number of stage hands required for the entire performance was 95, with another 50 men needed to operate the lamps. The first complete run-through of the 6 intermedi occurred on the 16th of March, 6 weeks before the opening night. Increasing numbers of technical difficulties emerged with the complex sets and machinery, which necessitated daily rehearsals from the 18th of March onwards. When one reads of the number of stage hands needed for this performance, it graphically illustrates the potential for something to go wrong during a performance and the absolute necessity of long rehearsal periods. The trouble and expense those responsible for court spectacles were prepared to go in order to ensure a memorable and outstanding performance is well illustrated by the 1589 Florentine production. When the intermedi rehearsals began in late December, the work on the machines and the set designs was still a long way from completion. Emilio de Cavalieri, therefore, insisted that the carpenters and scene painters moved to the Palazzo Vecchio to work so that the Uffizi Theatre was empty and quiet for the intermedi rehearsals. Then, once the rehearsal was finished for the day, the craftsmen could return to the Uffizi Theatre to continue working by candlelight. Even though providing candles for night construction work was an added expense, and the production team were always looking for ways to reduce expenditure, Cavalieri was still prepared to incur this expense in order to start rehearsing on stage with the groups of singers, musicians, and dancers required in the intermedi. A second illustration of the amount of trouble and expense that organisers of court spectacles were prepared to undergo is found in the number of times new and mostly ephemeral buildings were constructed in order to accommodate those attending banquets and other entertainments. In the 70 years between 1546 and 1626, for example, there were at least 14 temporary structures built just in or close to London alone. The largest and most famous of such buildings was constructed for Henry VIII at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. It was much more than just a large hall or empty space. The ground floor provided space for the wine cellars and offices and had brick walls, as you can see here, while the first floor, constructed of painted canvas on timber frames, comprised, quote, apartments for the royal entourage, a gallery, a 100-foot chapel, and a 220-foot banquet hall, end quote. Perhaps the most expensive part of this temporary building was the glass used to construct the large windows. In the early 16th century, glass windows, especially large ones, were still uncommon and extremely expensive. Even approximately 100 years later, when the French Queen Margherita de Medici replaced stained glass windows in one of her palaces with clear glass, it was regarded as an unprecedented luxury. I would now like to move on to the problems and disasters that did occur. The problems encountered during performances of court spectacles range from more minor annoyances, such as audience overcrowding and excessive noise, to serious catastrophes, such as a fire during a performance. Some disasters just involved embarrassment for the performers, while others resulted in death. Some problems were unforeseen, while others were the result of rushed and hurried preparations. While we'll probably never know what was the cause of the arguments and fights encountered by Castiglione in 1513, there are primary sources that do describe how a spectacle came to a grinding halt. In August 1389, a magnificent entry and reception was organised in Paris for the Queen of France, Isabella of Bavaria. Froissart records the events in some detail. The day after Isabella's ceremonial entry into Paris, there was a banquet, and right from the beginning, overcrowding was a problem, with Froissart recording that, quote, the crowd in the hall was so dense it was difficult to move, end quote, and that servers could only distribute the food to the 500 ladies with the greatest difficulty. It was when the spectacles began, and a castle, an assault tower, and a ship entered the hall, that things really started to fall apart. To quote Froissart again, but the entertainment could not last long because of the great crush of people around it. A table near the door of the Parliament chamber was overturned by force. The ladies who were sitting at it had to get up hurriedly without ceremony. The great heat and stink of the crowd almost caused the Queen to faint, and a window behind her had to be broken to let in the air. The King saw what was happening and ordered the performance to stop. This was done, and the tables were quickly cleared and taken down to give the ladies more room. The wine and the spices were served hurriedly, and as soon as the King and the Queen had gone to their apartments, everyone else left also, end quote. Audience overcrowding was usually the result of too many people being admitted into the hall, as while tickets of admission were issued, those at the door often allowed individuals without tickets to enter. This happened in 1615 for a performance of the Ballet de Madame, at which Elizabeth, eldest sister of the French King Louis XIII, was one of the lead-in dancers. In this instance, it is believed that the overcrowding was an act of sabotage by the Queen Mother's opponents, who had distributed counterfeit tickets secretly beforehand to uninvited commoners. In this case, the overcrowding caused the performance to be abandoned and to be performed again 3 days later on the 22nd of March. Furthermore, the chaos diminished Marie de Medici's image as a competent leader. In a report sent back to the Dowager Grand Duchess Christine of Lorraine by the Florentine agent in Paris, Luca degli Asini Fabroni, the confusion is described thus, quote, "With all the preparation complete, it pleased their majesties that the rehearsed ballet be performed in its entirety. Despite the fact that 2,000 tickets had been distributed the day before, in accordance with the capacity of the great Salle de Bourbon, so that things could proceed with comfort and calm, nevertheless, due to the falsification of tickets, nearly 2,000 uninvited people entered with great uproar. When the Queen saw that not a speck of space remained in the hall, it was resolved to remove half of the commoners and other low-class individuals. This displeased the Queen so much that the day's event was cancelled. To those people who had managed to enter at great pains came no other satisfaction than to return home with dashed hopes and damaged wheels, and some even having lost jewellery." The entertainments devised in honour of the French king, Henry II, in 1558 by the city of Paris are a superb example of the problems caused by inadequate preparation time. Henry only gave 9 days' notice of his intention to celebrate the recapture of Calais after 210 years of English occupation by attending a banquet in the city hall. It was only 5 days later, a mere 4 days before the event was to take place, that the Parisian merchants realised that more was required of them than just a banquet. So several masquerades were hastily organised to follow the banquet. What actually followed was more akin to a shambles. Even from the beginning, things fell apart. The king's guards allowed all their friends into the hall, even if they did not have an invitation. So the hall became overcrowded and totally disordered, with the noise emanating from the audience often drowning out the actors' speeches. The excessive audience numbers also meant not only was it difficult to hear the actors, it was almost impossible to see them. Due to the very short lead-in time, Estienne Jordel, the poet and dramatist responsible for the masquerades, was forced to, quote, "cut parts, to improvise speeches, and to rehearse his amateur players right up to the hour of the banquet," end quote. Does this sound familiar to anyone? In spite of this last-minute rehearsing, some of the actors still forgot their parts. The hall was not cleared after the banquet, and so the machines could not fit into the small amount of empty available space. Furthermore, the carpenters responsible for the stage machinery did not follow instructions and made the machines too large for the available space. The ship carrying 10 musicians, therefore, became stuck in the doorway into the hall, with entry only possible after its mast was broken off. Similarly, the costumes were not as specified, and the young children who represented Amorini were so taken with their costumes that they, quote, "refused to spoil their new clothes by attaching wings to them," end quote. Jordel himself was traumatised by the cascading disasters and suffered memory loss in the middle of his performance. Performance problems also occurred during outdoor events, and these ranged from weather-related problems, such as a collapse of temporary entertainment structures due to storms, as occurred at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, when the French king's pavilion was destroyed by a bad storm, to difficulties caused by poor planning. The latter is exemplified by the entertainment staged in honour of Queen Elizabeth I on her visit to Bristol from the 14th to the 21st of August 1574, where a 3-day mock siege was held, involving over 400 combatants, in which the fort of peace was attacked by the forces of war. Unfortunately, the organisers positioned the besieged fort too far away from the Queen, and the speeches addressed to her could not be heard. This called for drastic action, and so, quote, Mr. John Roberts, barrister and later Mayor of Bristol, swam fully clothed across the Avon River to present the Queen with a book of all the speeches, petitioned for her aid in their military effort, then plunged back into the river to return to the siege, end quote. The background to this entertainment was the Treaty of Bristol that was to be signed at the end of August. The goal of the treaty was to settle diplomatic and trade disputes which had arisen between England and Spain. Bristol's prosperity depended on trade, and the town's merchants were firmly on the side of peace and an amicable resolution to the trade dispute. Therefore, it was important that their speeches be heard and understood by Queen Elizabeth, which may account for the heroic efforts of John Roberts. The pitfalls and disasters that struck on the day of a performance of a spectacle or entertainment could also blight the rehearsals. Often problems were caused by the absence of key personnel from the rehearsals. This may have been the cause of difficulties encountered during the rehearsals held for the wedding celebrations of the Duke of Parma, Odoardo Farnese, and Margherita de Medici, planned for October 1628. Already in March of that year, there were problems. The musicians were not able to coordinate their tempi with the speed of movement of the machines. The singers were inexperienced and not singing well, and Monteverdi's musical effects were not working as intended. Dennis Stevens hypothesizes that, quote, perhaps Monteverdi had already left Parma for Venice, and without his guidance and supervision, the musicians were unable to give of their best, end quote. In Mantua in December 1591, it was the absence of the maestro di ballo from the rehearsals of the Balletto della Cieca which seemed to be the reason for the work falling apart. In one letter to Duke Vincenzo Gonzaga, his secretary Annibale Chiepo wrote, quote, the Balletto della Cieca is giving us difficulty because of those who have already rehearsed it in the presence of your Highness. As I understand the situation, some have now left. Some are sick, and some have become so stubborn in not wanting to be present at rehearsals that after the absence of Isacchino, the maestro di ballo, for a few days, everything had to be begun again from the beginning. So at Mantua, it was definitely the dancers who were causing delays and problems. The letter by Chiepo also illustrates the importance of having a strong and clear chain of command and responsibility for such large-scale and complex multimedia events. Certainly contemporary theoretical writings on the subject of staging intermedi from both Italy and France all agreed that the best method to guarantee the optimum outcome was to have only one man bear overall responsibility for such an event, whether it be a tragedy, comedy, pastoral, a ballo, an intermedio, or an opera. While this advice may have seemed sensible in theory, it was not always followed in practice. For example, in Florence in 1589, there was a three-way split of responsibility between the humanist and musician Giovanni de Bardi, who was responsible for the stage direction and had conceptual responsibility for the six intermedi, Bernardo Buontalenti, chief architect and engineer at the Medici court, who was in charge of the visual and technical side of the production in the Uffizi Theatre, and Emilio de Cavalieri, whose roles encompassed the musical direction and choreography, the composition of some of the music, as well as keeping the accounts and acting as a communication channel between the Grand Duke and the other members of the creative team and the workmen at the Uffizi. Perhaps this divided responsibility may have helped create some of the problems encountered during the long weeks of rehearsing. As mentioned earlier, the first complete run-through on stage of the 6 Intermedi occurred on the 16th of March 1589, 6 weeks before the opening night. Daily rehearsals started 2 days later. But even so, the notebooks of the production cum stage manager, Girolamo Seriacoppi, record scenes of frantic activity from the end of March and into April. The lighting, both candles and oil lamps, was not yet satisfactory and continued to present problems of excessive smoke, heat, and unpleasant odours. Clouds were not operating properly. Sea monsters still had to be finished, and work on the construction of the large freestanding puppet representing Lucifer, with its movable head, horns, and wings, was well behind schedule. In fact, the green taffeta for Lucifer's wings was only ordered on the 25th of April. And just to give you an idea of the work involved in just one of these large puppets, Lucifer was 8 braccia, or about 4 meters in height from his chest to his head. And the puppet had to appear through an open trapdoor, which itself had to be decorated so that it resembled a lake of ice. Even 6 weeks before the first performance, other large movable constructions were also not complete. For example, the python with which Apollo fought in Intermedio 3. Apollo was played by the dancer Agostino, but when Apollo was flying through the air, a cardboard figure held aloft by a wire was substituted for the dancer. But even though the puppet was cardboard, it was still dressed in a real costume that was identical to that worn by Agostino. As rehearsals continued, deficiencies in costumes became apparent. On the 11th of March, for example, Body ordered additional decoration be added to the costumes of the dancers in Intermedio 3, as they appeared to be very lacklustre when seen from the body of the hall. Changes to the colour of the clouds were necessary in order to ensure that they did not fade into the overall backdrop, and some of the stage hands on the overhead catwalk were found to be visible to the audience when the clouds opened. If all this was not enough, attention also had to be paid to the basic mundane matters such as toilet facilities. In an entry in Seriacoppi's notebook for the 18th of March, 1589, there is a comment that the, quote, piss buckets, unquote, are too full and stinking, and all of them must be emptied more often. Sometimes it was rehearsal that precipitated drastic alteration in the planned program. On the 9th of February 1525, 40 Venetian senators and 60 ladies attended a 6-hour rehearsal of 3 commedie. Unfortunately, one of these theatrical pieces caused much offence and was condemned by the audience because of its crude content and derogatory tone in regard to women. To quote from Sanudo, "Then the Paduans, Rusante and Menato, dressed as peasants, put on a rustic-style commedia that was very lascivious with very dirty words, to the point that it was condemned by all and they were yelled at. There were almost 60 women on the stands wearing veils, and the young ones had their hair in coifs, and they shuddered at what was being said in their name. The whole ending was about messing around and cuckolding their husbands." End quote. After that reaction, the organisers had no choice, and in the intervening 4 days between the rehearsal and the performance, this commedia was cut, and another prose piece which was more respectful to women was inserted in its place. To quote from Sanudo again, "Today, although the weather was bad, The Commedia of the Trionfanti was put on at the Car Ariane at San Rafael, and it was very lovely and chaste. About 100 women attended, and the Commedia that the Trionfanti had the players recite was not the dirty one, but instead the one by Rusante in the rustic style." End quote. Fire was an ever-present threat to theatrical performances in early modern Europe, as not only were torches and candles used to illuminate the performance space, but many spectacles also included dances by performers carrying torches while they danced, as you can see here. To give you an idea of the sheer number of lights that were positioned around the stage area only of the Uffizi Theatre for the performances of La Pellegrina and the Intermedi, we know that there were hundreds of lamps, each holding 2 to 4 lights, positioned at the sides and front of the stage platform for general lighting. More lamps were placed behind the scenery and still more in the flyloft in order to create the impression of stars twinkling in the sky. Then there were even more chandeliers, candles and lamps positioned around the theatre to illuminate the audience space. All in all, there were thousands of lights used for this performance. While no incendiary accident happened to mar the performances of the play and Intermedi, there was a fire in the theatre on the 21st of December 1588, when 2 workmen left a burning candle on a pile of planks of wood, probably after one of the night rehearsals. In 1589, the lamps and chandeliers were all fixed, but often torches or candles were carried by torchbearers or pages or by the dancers themselves. The ballet at the court of Lorraine in Nancy in 1606 began with the entry of 8 pages, each of whom carried 2 torches of white wax. The costume designs by Jacques Bellange include images of 2 pages with their white wax torches. Both these designs convey a visually stunning impression with the elaborately and sumptuously decorated costumes of the pages, from their headgear to their shoes, and with the large torches they hold in each hand. It is interesting to note that both pages are wearing flexible but sturdy gloves in order to protect their hands from any dripping wax, which is shown as running down the sides of the torches. In this ballet, the pages do not dance, but in other early 17th century ballets de cour, there are examples of dancers entering carrying torches and then continuing to dance with their torches. In the 1605 Ballet de Lorraine, for example, 12 pages enter, quote, each holding 2 white torches in his hands, dressed in incarnate and white, wearing little white boots covered in tinsel, making 1,000 passages and figures, end quote. From the description of the torches carried by the dancers in the first entree of the 1615 Ballet de Madame, and from the illustrations by Bellange, it seems that the flames on these torches were large. They were not small match-size flames, to quote from the 1615, a description of the 1615 ballet. Quote, each of these 9 little children bore on his head 4 great lights, and in his hand 2 great torches that flared from the wrists upwards, which meant that the flame was a good 2 feet high, without there being, however, any spark from it, and without its in the least way troubling those who were carrying them, end quote. While the author of this description of the 1615 ballet may have had no qualms about the danger of these 2 feet high flames, the children who were dancing with them, however, may have had other reactions. Certainly, when dancers performed with torches, their movements were often more complex than a simple procession. Cesare Negri published 2 theatrical torch dances in his treatise Le Grazie d'Amore, and in these 2 choreographies, the dancers execute jumps, cross diagonally, and weave around each other in haze, with each crossing movement necessitating a change of the torch from one hand to the other in order to present the appropriate empty hand to the next approaching dancer. This late 16th century image of a dance during a wedding banquet at a grand hall at Dusseldorf shows the 4 men who are carrying large torches are also performing what could be jumping steps. So they're obviously, they're moving in a vigorous manner. They're not just making little slow processional steps. Perhaps the most famous or infamous example of a spectacle devastated by fire comes from the 1392 festivities at the French court. In this case, it was the highly flammable costumes of the dancers, constructed of flax and pitch, which caused the disaster. The 6 dancers, that is the French king and 5 high-ranking noblemen, were disguised as wild men, and though accounts differ, it appears that a torch carried by a member of the audience who approached too closely to the dancers in order to determine their identity accidentally set fire to their costumes. 4 of the dancers died. A 5th saved himself by jumping into a vat of water, while the king was saved by the Duchess of Berry, who smothered the flames in the yards of heavy fabric of her dress. And you can see this is depicted on the left-hand side of this illustration. The reaction of the Duchess of Berry and her fellow audience members to the tragedy taking place before their eyes would have been the natural human reaction to such a disaster: horror, despair, fear. But for less serious problems, the reaction of the audience members varied. The French king, Henry IV, for example, is reputed to have been highly amused when the fireworks associated with an indoors barriers performance caused the hall in which the military spectacle was taking place to catch on fire, thereby ending the performance. In 1614, when audience overcrowding marred a performance of the ballet of the Argonauts, the French queen was incandescent with anger. The poet Françoise de Malherbe described the occasion thus: "On Thursday we saw the ballet which we had all been waiting for. I shall say nothing about it except that there never was such chaos, in which the dancers, however, had something to be grateful for, because the whole conception was hardly worth the money spent on it. The fault for the failure is attributed to the lack of space available for dancing. The captain of the guards was unwilling to disoblige anyone and admitted everyone who turned up. The enclosure was so thronged that even a single man would have had difficulty in passing through. The Queen saw this crowding on her arrival and flew into the greatest rage I have ever seen her in, and, turning around, declared that the ballet should not be danced. After a while, the Queen returned with the King, who had already been put to bed, and then the ballet was performed in a slipshod fashion, not as it is described in the printed account." End quote. I would now like to turn to an unusual and interesting account of the audience's reaction to a bungled dance performance that should have included the presentation of speeches to the French King Henry IV. In 1605, the French Queen Margherita de Medici and 11 princesses danced in a ballet de cour before the king and members of the elite. The end of this ballet was unexpected, as it did not follow the usual pattern. After the completion of the grand ballet danced by the Queen and the princesses, a new set of performers entered the hall to the sound of trumpets, oboes, and drums. These performers included 2 live camels ridden by 2 savages, a dwarf and a Tartar. The animals and their riders then tried to dance a galliard, a dance that required agility, expertise, and for some variations, strength. One eyewitness to the ballet described the final scene in this manner, quote, "It was the greatest pleasure in the world to see the syncopes made by these beasts who, hearing the trumpets, drums, oboes, violins, lutes, and other sorts of instruments, made a noise, a great discordant din, and seeing that the ladies pissed themselves, and that the majority of gentlemen were disposed to shit from laughter over the ballet, the performers were so ashamed they were unable to speak a word. They were given wine and vinegar, that is, they were given encouragement and also the opposite of encouragement, ridicule. So they were given wine and vinegar, yet they still couldn't say a thing and lost their voices completely, which caused His Majesty to command them to deliver their speech in writing. The camels exited the room well mocked and ashamed, and the best way they had of ending this embarrassing situation was that everyone got in his coach and went to write their speech in order to have it seen the next day by the king." End quote. In this case, the audience's reaction was so extreme that it literally stopped the performance in its tracks, even though the performers were about to deliver a speech to the king. The audience obviously did not feel inhibited at spoiling a speech directed towards the king. They did not suppress their laughter so that the performers could regroup and deliver their speech to the sovereign. The ridicule by the audience and the subsequent cessation of the performance indicates that in the context of this performance, the relationship between the king and the audience was altered. Even in the French court, the interactions between the king and members of the court were controlled and regulated by social protocols. Yet in this performance situation, the hierarchy and order demanded by these social protocols were broken down, and the relationship between the monarch and the rest of the audience became closer to one of equality. To conclude, it is clear that in spite of the necessity to produce a spectacular performance and a very strong desire to do so on the part of organisers, things did go wrong. Performances were not always as described in the printed accounts. Those involved in creating, rehearsing, and producing a spectacle had to contend with events outside of their control, like the weather, but also with recalcitrant performers, inattentive workmen, disobedient entry guards, inadequate preparation time, poor planning, and with all the potential problems associated with coordinating a very large technical and artistic workforce. As we have seen from the Venetian example, they also had to be able to quickly adapt to negative responses by the audience at a rehearsal. Given the nature and size of these spectacles, unforeseen events or performance disasters must have been more common than is recorded. An audience reaction of laughter and amusement at memory loss or stage fright by the performers points towards an expectation, or perhaps even an acceptance, that problems would arise during a performance. Thank you.